He said.
Today I want to do a video about the second greatest command of the law. Yesterday I was doing one about the greatest command of the law. Today it's the second greatest command, and I'm going to be doing it with reference to a parable called the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is one of three places where Jesus addresses this question of the greatest commands of the law. And most people interpreting the parable of the Good Samaritan say that it teaches that you have to be kind to everybody, even if it's your enemy. Well, that's part of it, but I think if you understand the Jewish content in the parable, it changes the flavor of it a little bit and makes it more emphatic. So I'm going to give you a number of details about the Judaism of Jesus's day that affect our interpretation of the parable. The first is to recall something I said in a video about the oral law, which was that there was a split in Judaism in Jesus's day between the Judaism of the temple, which was the Sadducees, and they were focused on worshiping Yahweh through the sacrifice of animals in the temple, and the Judaism of the rabbis, which was focused on the Torah and the oral law that they were building to protect the Torah. Now, the Sadducees weren't interested in the oral law, they were just interested in the temple. The Pharisees were not the only people helping to build the oral law, but they were one of the parties. Now, this is relevant when we look at the characters in the parable. There's a Levite, there's a priest. The Levites and the priests would have been Sadducees for the most part. They were involved in the worship of the temple. And in fact, they probably were on their way to Jerusalem. The parable says they were on the Jerusalem road, or from Jericho. Levites and priests lived in the general vicinity of Jerusalem, and they had to go to Jerusalem several times a year because they had to serve in the temple on a schedule. They weren't there all the time. I think all of the priests and Levites went there for the three major holidays. And then everybody went for a couple of weeks at a time on a regular schedule. This family for these 2 weeks, that family for that 2 weeks, and so on. So a priest or a Levite might have been on their way to Jerusalem to serve perhaps 5 times a year. This is relevant to the matter of handling a corpse. And in fact, this was one of the places where the Sadducees and the rabbinic Jews parted company. You see, the priests and the Levites, in the written law, they were not permitted to handle a corpse at all. Even if the corpse was their mother or their father, they were not permitted to handle a corpse. It made them unclean, and they would not be able to carry out the function that they were scheduled to carry out in the temple. Now, that would affect their doing their job, and nobody doesn't want to be able to do their job. But it would also be a significant blow to their income for the year, because the priests and the Levites serving in the temple, they get to keep some of the meat, they get to keep some of the skins. That's how they make money. So they would not want to handle a corpse if they encountered one. By contrast to that, the Pharisees in the oral law said that there was a human obligation to bury a stray corpse, even if it made you ceremonially unclean. So the Pharisees would have handled that very differently. This is relevant when you read in the parable that the traveler was left half dead. The word used there suggests that it was unclear whether the person was going to survive or not. And of course, the Levite and the priest, if they had stopped to help the fellow and he had died, they would have been ritually unclean. They weren't passing by because they thought they were better than he was. They weren't passing by because of arrogance or insensitivity. They were passing by because of the law. They didn't want to become ritually unclean. Now, a lot of these stories that they told in the Judaism of Jesus' day, and the questions that they asked, and the reason that they discussed things like what's the greatest command of the law and what's the second greatest, is because the precedence of laws was an important topic in Judaism. Sometimes the laws conflicted, and they wanted to be able to say which law took precedence whenever there was a conflict. We see an instance of it in John chapter 7, where Jesus mentions circumcising a boy on the 8th day, even if the 8th day is a Sabbath. That's an instance where the laws come into conflict. We see another instance in Luke chapter 14, I believe in verse 5, where it talks about a man's animal falling into a pit on the Sabbath day. And you're either going to help him get the animal out of the pit and violate the Sabbath, or you're going to keep the Sabbath and the animal's going to die in the pit. Those are the choices. So they wanted to know which law took precedence over which when there was a conflict between the laws. That's why when they were talking about the greatest command of the law, when somebody asked Jesus this, that's why he always answered with the first and second greatest commands of the law, because that's what they were after. They were after what's the precedence. Now, the question, who is my neighbor, is part of that, okay? Because if they're keeping the law, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and using that to supersede some other law, they don't want to incur God's wrath by, doing something for a neighbor whom God doesn't consider their neighbor. So they want to actually define who is the neighbor. This is part of building the oral law. And the lawyer in the parable, or in the story here, is probably a Pharisee, and he's asking for definition. Luke actually says he was trying to justify himself. But in fact, this was a question that was an open question in their culture. The house of Shammai in the Talmud would have said that a neighbor would be a Jew who keeps the law. A righteous Jew is a neighbor that one can serve in this manner and supersede other laws. The house of Hillel, also in the Talmud, would have said, no, your neighbor is any living soul. They were more liberal than the house of Shammai. But even the house of Hillel would have drawn the line at Samaritans, and here's why. There was an ongoing feud between the Samaritans and the Jews. You can read about it, the beginning of it in 2 Kings 17. You can read about the furtherance of it in Ezra chapter 4 and also in the book of Nehemiah. And there was a fair amount of history between those times. But in terms of this matter of the precedence of laws, the rabbis taught that adulterating the Torah caused one to lose one's soul. And the Samaritans, they had a version of the Torah. If you read the account in 2 Kings 17, it says that those are people who were brought by the Assyrians from some other country and planted in Samaria. But it says lions were killing them, and they thought it was because they didn't know how to worship the gods in that area. So they went back to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians dug up a priest from Samaria who came back to teach them how to worship Yahweh. And they did worship Yahweh along with worshiping their other gods. There is to this day a Samaritan Torah. The Samaritan Pentateuch gets consulted whenever anybody's doing a translation of the Torah. It's very similar to the Masoretic text, and they're still using it. So this is a real thing. But you see, the Samaritans had come to the Jews when they were rebuilding their temple and saying, here, let us work with you because we're part of the same religion. And the Jews had said to them, no, you're not. We don't want any part of you. You can read about that in Ezra. So the Samaritans were false practitioners of Judaism. They were adulterators of the Torah, and not just enemies, but unclean. We would see Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons in the same light that the Jews saw the Samaritans as far as that. Now, there were worse things. There were Samaritans who had been killed going into Jewish villages, and Jews who had been killed going into Samaritan villages, and things like that. There had been an incident of the Samaritans spreading human bones in the temple, written up in Josephus. So there was a lot of animosity here too. But at the religious level, they were saying the Samaritans are the ones who adulterate the Torah. Now, in Jesus's day, I'm told that there was Midrash stories of a priest, a Levite, and a Pharisee that was similar to this parable. And the point of that parable with the priest, the Levite, and the Pharisee would be to illustrate how the oral law and the rabbinic form of the religion was more humane than the mere oral written form of the religion. And Jesus was altering the Midrash in order to illustrate a point that he wanted to make. But do a little thought experiment with me here. If you were Jesus and you wanted to change that parable in order to make the point that you should show kindness to anybody, even if it was your enemy, which of the characters in the parable would you change into a Samaritan? Well, I think the clear answer to that is you'd make the person who was injured in the road into a Samaritan, and that would illustrate the point that you should help anybody, even if it's somebody that you hate. But that's not the person that Jesus changed, is it? No, he changed the Pharisee into a Samaritan. And this was very shocking. I mean, they wouldn't have thought of Samaritans as doing good things at all. But there was a specific point to it. The priest and the Levite step by because they don't want to become ritually unclean. And then a third person comes along who, technically, according to the rabbis, is not really even a living human soul. He is an adulterator of the Torah, and yet he is the one who shows kindness, at great risk to himself, in fact, because there's some danger of him being accused of causing the man's injury in the first place. But he provides for him. He plants him in an inn. He pays for his care. He says he'll come back later and settle up all the debts. He takes care of him in an excellent way. And Jesus is posing the question to this student of the law and asking him, who is it really who is adulterating the Torah? And who is it really who is keeping the Torah? It would be, if we were to tell the story today, it would be as though the third person we were talking about would say, along comes a gay Christian and does that. Now, am I endorsing gay Christianity? No, I'm not. But what I am doing is making the point that Jesus is making, which is, it doesn't matter how accurate your adherence to the Torah is, and it doesn't matter what other things you do. What matters is how well you keep the central elements of the law that God cares about, like caring for one's neighbor. If you do that, you are fulfilling the law. And if you fail to do that, even for ritual purity, you're adulterating the law. That's the point that Jesus was making. One more thing, and this is just a little additional information. Look at the picture I'm posting on the screen right now. This is actually taken from the Jericho Road fairly recently. You have to understand that when Jesus says that the priest and the Levite passed by on the other side, he was kind of making a joke. There is no other side. The guy might have been a little bit to the side, but he was certainly within kicking distance. It's a very narrow road. That's just so you have that picture in your mind. So there you have it. Parable of the Good Samaritan with some additional Jewish content to clarify it. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like me to speak to your group, my website, philweingart.net, has my contact information along with some articles and sermons that I've done. Also, you can get my books on Amazon.com. The Rabbi on the Mount, How Jesus' Judaism Clarifies the Sermon on the Mount, and also He's Greater Than You Know, Essays for a Doubting Christian, both available in trade paperback and Kindle format. Hope to hear from you soon.
And suddenly we saw